Every time I teach research methods to my students, particularly in terms of writing the review of literature, I always emphasize that they should have a narrative or a good story to tell in writing their literature review. However, even if I say this, even if I emphasize the importance of a good narrative, I know that my students oftentimes do not exactly know what I mean to say. So today, I decided to make this short video about what I exactly mean by narrative. And more importantly, I will discuss a typical narrative for a mediation study. Before I continue, I invite everyone to please subscribe to the channel. More than 90% of the people who are watching these tutorials and lectures are not subscribed. So I would appreciate it if you can help me and the channel grow by subscribing, especially if my lectures and tutorials have helped you in some way. Thank you very much. Now, this is not to say that there is only one possible narrative for a mediation study. However, more often than not, the things that I will discuss can be considered as a typical narrative. Therefore, if you're a student, you can use this as a guide or an inspiration here. So in mediation, we are testing a model wherein we have an independent variable that influences a dependent variable. For this particular lecture, I will interchangeably use independent variable, IV, or predictor variable, as well as dependent variable, DV, or outcome variable. Furthermore, the study would like to ask, why does the IV predict the DV, or why is the IV related to the DV? And that's the role of a mediator. The mediator serves as some kind of an explanatory mechanism for the supposed relationship of the IV and the DV. Now, as I present you a typical narrative, I will also present an example so that it will be more concrete. So in this example, this is the proposed model. So we have here bullying experiences predicting math performance as mediated by math engagement. To give you a brief background, these variables are called from the PISA 2022 data. PISA refers to the Program for International Student Assessment. So in this global assessment, they collected data in different countries, primarily about cognitive variables, including the performance of 15-year-olds in math, reading, and science. But aside from that, we also collected other variables, including experiences of bullying and math engagement. So basically, I'm hypothesizing that bullying negatively predicts math performance and that such negative impact is explained by math engagement. Therefore, I predict that bullying lowers math engagement, and it's the lowering of the math engagement that leads to the lower math performance. So what could the title of this study be? So it can be something like the mediating role of math engagement in the relationship between exposure to bullying and math performance. Now, the very first thing that you need to do is to write the literature review. Oftentimes, students write the introduction first, but I suggest that you suspend the writing of the introduction because without writing the literature review, you really have nothing to introduce yet. So the very first thing that we need to do is to write the RRL. In writing the RRL, it's important that you have an outline. Never write a literature review without an outline. The outline is partly informed by your initial readings, and at the same time, the outline provides you a guide as to what other materials you need to look for in building your literature review. This particular outline should convey a particular narrative or story. Given our example, here is what I would do. So in the first section of the RRL, I will talk about the outcome variable. And therefore, the first section heading of my literature review will be Filipino students' math performance in PISA 2022. Highlighting that my outcome variable is math performance in PISA 2022, and specifically, I'm talking about the performance of Filipino students. Why Filipino students? Because I'm from the Philippines. So in here, we have two columns. On your left is the generic outline, and then on your right is the outline that I've written specifically for the paper that I plan to write. So first, you introduce the outcome variable and also perhaps the context you are coming from. Okay. So in the specific research that I'm planning to write, I plan to discuss what PISA is, what it primarily measures to give some context. I will explain that for 2022, the focus is on math achievement. Now, another thing that you can do is to define the outcome variable if you think it's necessary to define. In here, I did not specifically talk about the definition of math performance because it's fairly understandable to the readers, but I did emphasize the math performance, particularly for PISA 2022. And then after defining the outcome variable, explain why the variable is important. The importance of a variable can be in terms of what are some of the consequences of the presence or the lack of this particular variable. So for example, if our outcome variable is math performance, we can discuss why talking about math performance or why studying math performance is important. So it says here, explain the importance of being good in math, both for the individual and the country, given that there is a country angle in the narrative. State that the Philippines' performance in math in the latest PISA, as well as the previous assessments, so PISA 2018. Unfortunately, the performance of the Philippines in these metrics are not very good, which makes it even more important to study. So it says here, considering the Philippines' poor performance, explain that it is important to understand what predicts math performance in PISA 2022. So essentially, that is the next step after defining and explaining the outcome variable. Because the outcome variable is important, suggests that it's important also to understand the things that can predict that outcome variable. You may identify a few candidate variables, but eventually focus on your actual predictor or independent variable. So in the case of the paper that I will write, discuss that the possible predictor are social variables that comprise students' sense of safety. Aside from that, I also will mention that socioeconomic status is a strong predictor because later on in the analysis, I plan to use socioeconomic status as a control variable. So I need to mention that in the narrative. And then the specific or the actual IV that I plan to use is bullying. So therefore, I highlight the importance of bullying as a potential predictor variable. Next is justify why you think that this predictor variable is important. So in the example I'm presenting, bullying is an important predictor because in terms of ranking, the Philippines also ranks highest in exposure to bullying, unfortunately. Now, with the introduction of the predictor variable, this serves as a good transition for the next section, which, you've guessed it, is about the predictor variable. So the next section of your literature review will be about the independent variable or the predictor variable. But not only that, you should talk about the IV as it relates to the dependent variable. So you might be noticing that my style of organizing the literature review is a bit different from how students typically do it. Normally, given the layout of this model, students will begin to talk about bullying and then perhaps math performance and then math engagement. But as you notice, I did not start discussing the IV. I started discussing the outcome variable or the DV instead. So in the example, the next section will be labeled as influence of bullying on math performance. So what do we do in this section? First, we define the independent variable or the predictor variable. In the example, I said there, define what bullying is. If you have information about the status of the IV among your chosen population, you can also describe that. So in the example, I said, describe Filipino students' experience of bullying. So you might need literature or statistics describing this. Next, discuss the typical consequences of the IV, but focus on its impact on the DV. So in the example, present the negative consequences of bullying, but then eventually focus on the influence of bullying on academic achievement. You'll notice that I'm not yet focusing on math performance. I'm trying to funnel towards math performance. So I'm first suggesting that bullying has an impact on academic performance in general, and then later on I will funnel it specifically to the specific subject of mathematics. Next, present empirical data. When we say empirical data, this refers to findings from previous research that suggests that the IV does predict the DV in the valence that you expect it to be. So in our example, present empirical data that bullying negatively predicts academic achievement, particularly in math. So that's the funneling that I said. And then the next one is to raise the question as to why the IV does impact the DV in the way that it does. And I'm highlighting the word why because that is the essence of mediation. That is the purpose of mediation. Mediation serves to answer the question why. So it's important that in your narrative, you raise that question. Otherwise, your proposed mediation is not justified. So in the example, I said, ask why bullying, kindly ignore the phrase and school safety there. I'm only focusing on bullying, negatively predicts math achievement. And so as soon as you raise this why question, you also have to suggest a possible answer. And that will be your opportune time to suggest a possible mediator. So suggest an explanatory variable or a mediator. So in the example, suggest that it might be because bullying weakens math engagement, which is the proposed mediator, which leads to poorer math performance. And by doing so, you are introducing your next section, which is, you guessed it right, it's about the mediator, which is math engagement. So you will notice that when I organize the outline, I try to make sure that as I end one section of the RRL, that is the opportunity for me to introduce the next section of the RRL. So that is what you refer to as a good transition. Oftentimes you hear this from your teachers. So this is a clear example of what your teacher mean by a good transition or a smooth transition. Before I continue, I want to talk about something. You will notice that in the right column, your right, you will notice that the content of the outline is not just about labels or nouns or topics that you need to discuss. An important thing in writing the outline is the thing that you should do. So you will notice that the outline always begins with the verb. No? Define, contextualize, present. That way, you also know what you will do. Not only the content that you will present, but also how you will present that particular content. So, the next section of our narrative is we talk about the mediating role of the mediator. So, in the example, in the third section of the RRL, I will talk about the mediating role of math engagement. What do we write here? First, we define the mediator. Therefore, we define academic engagement. Again, funneling it eventually to math engagement. After defining academic engagement, I then contextualize math engagement to a specific subject area, which is mathematics. In this specific case, perhaps I'm also going to talk about how math engagement was measured in PISA 2022. Next, present and discuss extensively a theory that can explain the mediator's role as a mediator. A theory that can explain how the IV can influence the mediator and how the mediator can influence the dependent variable. You're probably wondering, where is the section in the RRL wherein I need to talk about the theoretical framework? This is it. However, you don't label the section as the theoretical framework. You discuss the theory within this particular section. Theories are used to explain the relationships among variables. And because what you're trying to explain is a mediation relationship, a mediation model, therefore we use a theory to explain that particular model. And it's here where you present that theory and you use that theory in explaining the pathways of the model. So in our example, it says here, present a theory, one that is useful for our cause, which is to explain the mediating role of math achievement in the relationship between bullying and math performance. One that explains math engagement and particularly how social variables such as bullying contributes to math engagement and how math engagement leads to math performance. After presenting the theory, we now present our arguments for the first path, which is IV to the mediator, and the second path, which is mediator to the DV. So present your theoretical arguments for why the IV will influence the mediator. Now, I highlight the word arguments. So when we say arguments, I probably will need to have a separate video about this. But in summary, when we say argument, this is your attempt to explain and convince your reader that your prediction that the relationship of the IV to the mediator is indeed what you say it is. So in this case, I need to theoretically explain why bullying will lead to lesser math engagement. So that is the question. Why would the experience of bullying, if I'm a student, lead me to be less engaged in mathematics? And explaining that is the role of the theory, and that's what I will present. I will present the argument. I will present statements that will try to convince the reader why experiencing bullying will lower students' math engagement. After presenting your arguments, present empirical evidence. It's not enough that you have theoretically explained the relationship. You should support it by empirical evidence. When we say empirical evidence, this means to say findings from previous studies that supports the idea that bullying does have a negative impact on engagement. So that's the first path. Of course, the next one would be presenting your theoretical argument for the second path, which is from the mediator to the dependent variable. So in our example, theoretically explain why lesser math engagement will lead to poorer math performance. And similarly, after these arguments, present empirical evidence, present previous findings that suggest that lower engagement does indeed lower performance. It doesn't have to be necessarily about math. I suppose the relationship between engagement and performance in some other contexts can also be used as a potential empirical evidence for your expected relationship. And because of these arguments and empirical evidences, we can now loosely state our predictions, our hypothesis. You have the option to actually state your hypothesis at this stage, but if I were to write it, I'll probably put the actual hypothesis in the next section. So in our example, loosely state that bullying will weaken math engagement, which leads to poorer math performance. And you're basically just summarizing the theoretical arguments that you've presented a while ago. And finally, we now go to the last section of our literature review, which is labeled as the current study. So what do we have in the current study? In the current study, you basically state the objective of your study. For students, you can choose to phrase this as your research question. If your teachers are particular that you state explicitly what the research question is, then you may do so. What is the research question here? It could be, does bullying predict math performance in PISA 2022, and thus math engagement mediate the relationship between these variables? And then next, remind the readers about the key theoretical arguments that you have presented a while ago. So you've presented the theoretical arguments, in the previous section, just remind them about those things. And then after reminding them, now we can state our mediation hypothesis. So in my particular example, the hypothesis could be that bullying or bullying exposure will negatively predict math performance in PISA 2022. And the specific mediation hypothesis, which is math engagement, will mediate the relationship between bullying and math performance. Another thing that you can discuss here is the potential contribution of your paper in the general knowledge or even its possible contributions to specific institutions. And then finally, you can also include in the current study a preview of your methodological choices, or basically a brief discussion, a brief preview of how you plan to test your hypothesis. So are you going to do an experiment? In this case, we're not. We're going to use a cross-sectional explanatory research design. We're going to use the dataset from PISA 2022. We're going to use structural equations modeling to test the model. So those are the things that you can preview as the last section of your current study. All right, so that concludes our short lecture today about a typical narrative for the RRL for a mediation study. Again, this is not a template. By no means do I strongly impose this particular narrative, but I'm just showing you a possible narrative, a typical narrative. Oftentimes, when I read journal publications about a mediation study, I typically find these elements in their literature review. So once again, thank you for watching. And if this has helped you, I'm inviting you to subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.